Hello, my friends. We're continuing with our roadmap to right living based on the 52 qualities that Swamiji talks about in this wonderful little book, Affirmations for Self-Healing. We deal with each one. We deal with the affirmations, but I'm really much more interested in the qualities themselves. So let's start with a prayer, and then we'll go on. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to all. We are your children. We depend on you for wisdom and guidance. Help us to find our way through this world with so many choices, with so many conflicting cross currents of energy. Shine thy light upon us, that we may ever see the pole star of our salvation and move with courage, determination, and enthusiasm ever more steadily toward the divine goal. Om. Peace. Amen. So we are dealing with quality number 5, which is the quality of sharing. And we have made it all the way through 2 sentences. And we will attempt to go through a couple of more. There's only about 6 sentences in the whole section. This book was written at least 30 years ago, I think. Probably I could tell by looking, now that I brought it up. Let's see, first publication date. First publication date was 1988, so it was a long time ago. And unlike some of Swamiji's books, I don't think he ever revised it. I don't ever remember seeing any editing on this book. At one point, somebody rearranged it, I think. Or they rearranged the other readings, which are the Bible and the Gita readings, so that somehow the affirmations and the prayers, they would all match each other, because we use this for Sunday service. Now, I'm a little confused. There were 2 sets of readings, this one and the Bible and Gita one, and somebody went into a lot of trouble to make them match, which we did for a while, and then Swami decided he preferred the original order. So I don't know if this book was reordered, but he never edited it, as far as I know, which is actually very interesting. Most of the time, when he finished a book, he left it. Sometimes dramatically differently. He edited and re-edited. I don't know if it was Hope for a Better World. I know the book that ultimately became The Artist as a Channel went through 7 different rewrites before it was done. He wrote it first when he was 18, and then he just kept understanding the ideas more and more. What would happen also sometimes, you had to have a lot of patience to run our publications business. Swamiji wasn't interested in the short term, he was interested in the long term. And sometimes it wasn't until the book was actually in book form that he would realize it needed more editing. And so he would edit the recently published book. And whatever one it was published and then withdrawn and then republished, whether it was Hope for a Better World or which one it was. But this one, interestingly, he just got it right off the bat. And I'm just amazed, which is why I've always wanted to do this book like I'm doing it now, because every Sunday somebody would read this little paragraph and then we'd go work with the affirmations, because that was what the intention was. But the ability Swamiji has to translate subtle ideas into words and have it be just exactly so. And from the point of view of a writer, which I've now published a few books myself, and so I know a little more about writing than I did before. It's the economy of expression. Swamiji, and the economy of expression comes from absolute clarity of mind. This is one of the things I finally figured out. It took me years to be able to write. Swamiji, when I was in my mid-20s, actually tried to set me up to be a writer. And that was the life he presented to me as a possibility. But I just couldn't do it. I was too neurotic about writing, and I just couldn't do it. He actually finally decided that, and this is how he put it to me, you just don't have the confidence to be a writer, but you have the confidence to speak, so let's have you speak so that you can gain the confidence to be a writer. It's very interesting. He always knew our karma. So all of this was so that I could do that. Because when I actually was able to finally bring myself to be able to write, I realized how much I love that life. Because I love to communicate, and I like my own ideas. I'm much more interested in my own ideas than I am in the ideas of others. Please don't take that more seriously than I mean it. I'm just presenting it somewhat humorously. But I'm a creative artist type. And so I become inspired by the flow of creative energy. And so I like to be able to follow that without being distracted. The people who like to work with other people's ideas, it's a different kind of art form. Swami described being able for a leader to be able to create with other people's energies. That's the art form. Just like a writer creates with words, an artist creates with color or line, a leader creates with other people's energy. That's why the best leader, the people say, we did it ourselves. That's the Chinese proverb, because the leader has just allowed that energy to express. So I've had to play that role also, and I've learned to be better at it than I was when I started, because my temperament, which I discovered when I was alone in seclusion writing, was that I was able to communicate, but I was able to communicate just in the flow that was coming through me, and it was very fulfilling. This is Swamiji always knew. So coming back to that, I pay attention, and if you go through Swami's books, even the biggest books, the Gita commentary or the Revelations of Christ or the Path, any of them, you won't find a single extraneous word. And many times when people write, they have to circle around their ideas before they can say them, or they're not confident that they've been said, so they'll say them multiple times. That's what Swamiji said to me during the phases of my life when he would simply discard my writing, which was a long, arduous period of training. He said to me, when you aren't sure about what you want to say, just to be sure you say it 3 times. Which is exactly true. And where I was coming to with all of this little riff was, I gradually figured out that when I had trouble writing, it wasn't because I couldn't put words together, because look, I can put words together, but I didn't know what I wanted to say. So it wasn't an inability to write, it was the inability to think clearly, to really know what I wanted to say, who I am, why I'm writing this, and what the point is. And when I caught that, I suddenly realized that when I was having trouble writing, I wasn't going to get clearer if I just kept writing. That was when I would say it 3 times. I had to stop and really concentrate on what I wanted to say. And as soon as I knew what I wanted to say, I could say it like that. So what you see in Swami's writing is this extraordinary clarity of mind. And actually, I'll take that a step further because these are very important points. When I met Swamiji, I grew up in a very intellectual family, and until I was 15, I lived in Texas. And where we lived, it wasn't a high consciousness place. I don't know how else to put it. I don't want to be rude, but it wasn't. When I got to California and we moved into a college town, Claremont, California, where the Pomona colleges are, and I was going to school there, suddenly I was in a milieu, that's how you pronounce that word, with people who are just much more like me. And it was just, I was much more at home. But growing up, especially growing up to the age of 15, first my brother and then myself, we were just raised differently than most of the people around us. Not all of them, but most of them. And as a consequence, let me think what the thought was. Oh, let's see, just a moment. Thoughts have been slipping out of my head today. I'm sorry, I lost the idea. Oh, yes, but I valued intelligence. I sort of call intelligence as my hobby. And so when I met Swamiji, in addition, of course, to everything else, he was just so intelligent. The first time I heard him speak, I don't remember anything he said. But I remember when he finished, I thought, oh, this is the most intelligent man I've ever met, which was like a bonus, because I had already decided he was my spiritual teacher and he was the pole star I'd been looking for before he spoke. I made that decision. Yes, it was rather interesting, but that's what happened. After he spoke, I realized that he was also extraordinarily intelligent, which he proved and continued to the last breath. And I thought, isn't that nice? Because this will be much more fun. And I used to wonder, I marveled over the first years that I knew him, just how he could be so insightful, so exact, so amazingly accurate in the way he understood, I'm going to use the word everything. And then I realized that the clarity of his mind came from the clarity of his heart. And Master had that phrase, reason follows feeling, which means if we are emotionally and feelingly predisposed toward a certain perception, then that feeling will influence our minds and will come up for reasons with it, which is why very intelligent can be racists and bigots. Even highly educated people can come up with preposterous ideas because they have an inclination on their feeling nature to want to be superior to others, perhaps to be sadistic, to have power, whatever it might be. And so their mind will come up with all sorts of reasons. But Swamiji's heart was entirely committed to the truth. And not the truth in a dogmatic sense, but the truth simply to what is, which is to say Sanatana Dharma. And because his heart was committed only to what is, and he didn't have all these vrittis in his chakras and all these cross currents of egos and all this personal necessity to protect or to prove, his mind was perfectly clear. So he could look at any situation, he just wasn't afraid to know. If this is what's happening, this is what we have to deal with. So often with us, the rest of us, we're afraid that if something is true, what will I do? If my husband is actually an alcoholic, what will I do? If my child is on the autistic spectrum, what will I do? If I'm never going to get married, what will I do? If I actually have a debilitating disease, what will I do? So we go into the state called denial, which doesn't help anything, but the feeling nature compels us not to be able to think clearly. Swamiji's point of view is, it's true anyway. Not acknowledging it doesn't make it less true. In fact, as I've come to understand, it rules us from the dark. And if it rules us from the dark, we make all kinds of very bad decisions because we don't know why we're doing what we're doing. And so what I've realized, my first step toward becoming more like Swami, is to realize that the perception of the truth and the decision about what you're going to do about it are two separate things. And if you feel like what you're going to do about it is the same as perceiving it, then you get frightened about perceiving it. But if you're willing to perceive what is true and then decide the appropriate response, then there's less fear about perceiving. Swamiji was not afraid of either side. He just wanted what was true. Simple as that. So he could just look at everything and speak it. And speak it simply, because he didn't have to construct a whole story around it. So, coming back, which actually all of that was about today, because what is so delightful for me in working with this book is I read one sentence and I get to think about it for days, really. So he says, people who gladly share with others feel themselves bathed by a constant inner stream of happiness. Look at the juxtaposition. He says a constant inner stream of happiness. And part of the reason I was giving such a long presentation about how Swami writes is that he never used hyperbole. Is that hyperbole to say he never used hyperbole? He never exaggerated. And one of the things about him, among many things, that was so wonderful was you could always believe him. Speaking of him training me to write, much of the time when I wrote never saw the light of day. It just inspired him to write what was needed. And I'm not talking about books. I'm talking about publicity and articles. And because what I did for years was write publicity for Ananda. And he would, if it got used at all, he would write on it, this is okay. This is good. Occasionally he would say this was very good. And when he would say this was excellent, I knew it was excellent. He didn't ever try to support me by not telling me the truth. Maybe he worked with other people differently, I don't know. But that's certainly how he always worked with me. So you could always absolutely believe him. And certainly when he wrote a book, he just wrote the truth. People who gladly, and that's an important word, because it's not just people who share with others grudgingly because I have to, because my mother told me I can't have dessert unless I share with my brother. That's not gladly sharing. That's sharing because there's something in it for me. And we're not really sharing, we're just trading at that point. But people who gladly share with others, and I talked about this yesterday, whose spontaneous response is that your happiness is my happiness. Who gladly share with others feel themselves bathed. Bathed is an interesting word. Bathed means immersed in a constant inner stream of happiness. Now, who among us doesn't want a constant inner stream of happiness? So much of what we're doing all the time is trying to ease, the inner uncomfortableness. And if merely by sharing, but sharing happily, we can be bathed by a constant inner stream of happiness, why would we hoard? I've gotten so used to the fact that I have this delight in passing things over. We, in our communities, and it actually the whole world now, I live in California, there's wildfires, there's always a possibility of earthquake, there's so many different things that could happen. Many of us have what we call emergency preparedness. And in our community, we have an emergency preparedness committee that actually camped out in the center of our courtyard for a weekend and ate freeze-dried food and lived in little tents. And it was absolutely delightful. I would stand on my balcony and watch them out there. And actually, they had a wonderful time because, the end of the world had come, so they couldn't be on their computers and they couldn't, in their little scenario. So they just had to sit around and enjoy each other's company. And that's, I've often thought when, I remember in Japan when there was a very bad earthquake some years ago, many of the people from there wrote because some of the houses were destroyed or they weren't safe. People were living on the streets, camping on the streets, and they talked about the camaraderie, the company, the attention to one another, the pleasure in each other's company that they were usually so isolated and too busy to have. So, but I have all my emergency preparedness. I always have to order at least 2 of everything or 4 of everything because I know for a fact I'm just going to give what I have away. Because after all these years, I've really understood, let me phrase it differently. I've experienced what Swami writes here. To keep it for myself when someone else doesn't have it, it doesn't make me happy. I have a principle in myself that if it occurs to me to give it away, I try not to behave impulsively. Because, to behave impulsively is not necessarily to behave consciously. And I have to check my intuition. But if I have an impulse to give something away, I try to check my intuition and live with it. Sometimes I live with it for a longer time. Is this really coming from the right place? Is my reason inspired by my feeling, or is my reason clouded by my feeling? And then if it feels that it's what not to do, then I pass it on. Because if I would feed myself, why would I not feed someone else? And as what I'm struggling with here is, I'm not trying to say, look at me, I share. That's not the point. I've experimented with what Swamiji has said here, and I've simply found it to be true. Generosity of heart is a very happy way to live, and selfishness is not. So then he goes on to say, sharing is the doorway through which the soul escapes the prison of self-preoccupation. And this is also something that we were talking about. Self-realization is not doing it exactly right. This is the neuroses that a lot of people get involved in on the spiritual path. And many years ago, I think I referred to this already in a magazine that was published then called Psychology Today. I don't know what its next generation is or if it still exists. And the article was The Dark Side of Meditation. And it was probably in the 70s that it was published. And those of us who were involved in the meditation world, we were always amused by how the media would portray what we were doing. But The Dark Side of Meditation turned out to be an actually very accurate article. Driven, ambitious, type A, perfectionist people take up meditation because they're so neurotic. They need some way to calm themselves down. But meditation for God realization, not meditation for relaxation, but meditation for God realization tells you that you have to become perfect. So, naturally perfectionists would be driven to try to become infinitely perfect. And so the dark side of meditation is the more you do it, the more neurotic you become. And when I used to teach Meditation 1, the beginning meditation courses in our teaching center in Palo Alto, it was so interesting to me how often, first class you teach people to begin to meditate, the second class, there would always be a solid group of people, especially where I live in Silicon Valley, where a lot of type A, perfectionist-driven people live. Their concern would be that they were doing it wrong. And we'd have to go through a whole lot of doing it wrong. No, there's no way to do it wrong. But I still had thoughts. Yeah, actually you still have thoughts. And so sometimes such people can't keep meditating. But this is why also, and this is interesting, and here's the next line, sharing is one of the clearest paths to God. And when I read that just before I started talking to you this morning, I thought, wow, that is quite a promise. Gladly sharing with others, and you'll be bathed in a constant inner stream of happiness. Sharing is the way the soul escapes from self-preoccupation. And true self-realization is just simply that we stop worrying about ourselves. I learned that. It was through sharing. It was through karma yoga, through service. When I was 19 and I read my first book about self-realization by Swami Vivekananda, 3 years before I met Swami, he said he had a few secrets of happiness. One of them is, don't think about yourself and you'll be happy. And I clearly remember at the time thinking, what else is there to think about? I wasn't selfish, but I was incredibly self-preoccupied. And that's been my battle. I've always been generous, but I've been worried, just worried about how I fit in. And my way of doing it was that I always was calculating my own advantage. That was the way how I would put it. Fortunately, having a rather light center of gravity by the grace of God, my advantage was always, how can I have the most fun? And sometimes my advantage was, how can I be the most helpful? But nonetheless, it was self-preoccupied, always aware of how I fit into the situation. And it's a hard battle, self-preoccupation. So he says sharing is one of the ways that the soul, which is the infinite part of ourselves, escapes from this egoic self-preoccupation. We don't realize that self-preoccupation is the prison in which we live. When I was younger, I always thought that I would have children, and it was partly just because I liked children and it seemed natural, and it was the culture of the time. But it was also because I wanted meaningful work, and I couldn't really see anything else that looked to me as meaningful as it would be to help other people to grow up and have good lives. When I really understood self-realization, when I came to Ananda, I almost immediately lost interest in having children, and I never have, because I realized what I wanted was self-expansion. And then I realized even more subtly, I was imprisoned by egoic self-preoccupation. I didn't have that vocabulary until I met Swamiji, but it was egoic self-preoccupation. Just if I have to spend just one more day being myself, I will actually literally go mad, which I considered, but I decided it wasn't a good idea. But anything that gets us out of self-preoccupation. So when I first came here to Ananda, I happen to be at Ananda Village right now. When I first came to Ananda Village, summer of 1971, I was put into the kitchen at our retreat, which was what is now the seclusion retreat, which was also the home to about 30 members of our community. And nobody had private kitchens, almost no one. So I was cooking not only for the guests, but for all the community residents. We served 3 meals a day, 6 days a week. We had one fasting day. And where nobody really fasted, they just came into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. But nonetheless, I didn't cook. On that day I went to town. I had one assistant who was only semi-competent. I was 24. I loved it. I worked day and night, really 7 days a week. I absolutely loved it because I was so busy serving, sharing with others, that for the first time in my life, there was just no energy left to calculate my own position. And there was no position to calculate. I knew what my position was. I was going to be at the sink, I was going to be at the stove, I was going to be at the counter, or I was going to be in the truck, filling the truck with food so I could be at the sink or the stove or the counter. And I was so happy. I just was happier than I'd ever been in my life. And I remember when I realized, this is when I realized what was happening. Somebody came up to me, and this actually happened. They said, "How are you?" And when they said, "How are you?" I got startled, because all of a sudden they were turning the attention back to me, and all of a sudden I began to wonder how I was. And then I remembered Vivekananda, don't think about yourself and you'll be happy. I was so happy sharing with others that I just forgot about myself. And the lack of self-preoccupation, in other words, to live in a greater reality, is the definition of spiritual expansion. That's why sharing, Swami says, is one of the clearest paths to God. God bless you, my friend.